Hello, everybody. I am Jeff Finkel, CEO of the ArcView Group. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on valuation and litigation in the cannabis industry. Our consulting services group provides valuation services. It's actually one of our core practice areas. And recently, we've gotten inquiries on litigation support and expert witness testimony. So we decided to put together a webinar to educate our audience of operators and investors. So Jason, Jan, and Josh, who I will pass it off to shortly, will walk through an overview of the scenarios in which businesses need a valuation, what that valuation process looks like, what to consider when valuing a cannabis business, and an overview of the preparation required for litigation or dispute resolution and more than that. So I'm really looking forward to this. But before I begin, for you new viewers, let me introduce you to the ArcView Group. And for our old timers, you'll just have to sit through it again. I apologize. But anyway, the ArcView Group was founded in 2010 as an investor conference producer. I think we produced over 50 investor conferences at which investors could meet emerging cannabis companies. Now, in addition to that, we operate a venture fund called the ArcView Collective Fund, and we have a consulting arm that provides a variety of services such as license application work, creating the SOPs, the operating plans, and all that's required, business valuations, which of course is the subject for today, brand expansion plans, mentoring to social equity licensees and teaching them the important skills of how to communicate with investors and ultimately how to raise money, and more recently, an investor readiness service that helps entrepreneurs message to investors, helps them understand the type of investors to go after based on the type of the business and the stage of the business, and also helps them communicate to their board and shareholders at the right interval with the right amount of detailed information and metrics. And we also produce a lot of webinars because, hey, we all want to keep learning, and there's so much to learn in this sector as it evolves and new states approve commercial cannabis programs. I think some 55,000 people or so have registered for our webinar since 2020. And I imagine by now we've produced somewhere between 85 or 90 webinars on a variety of subjects. In fact, feel free to go to our replays page at the ArcView Group. I'm going to actually, in a minute, I'm going to actually splice that into the chat group so you have it, www.arcviewgroup. We have a library of our impactful webinars on all those topics with industry thought leaders. So before I quickly move on, let me do two things. First, we have a poll of questions. So Guillermo, if you would be so kind as put the poll up for people to answer. We do appreciate your feedback. So I'll thank you in advance. And then secondly, I'd like to thank our strategic alliance partners. First, the cannabis team for cannabis staffing and executive search. Second, Arcstone Securities and Investments. They do capital advisory and fundraising services. And our data partner, Hoodie Analytics. We certainly appreciate their support of ArcView and their place in this cannabis ecosystem and community. All right, so let's get going. I'd like to first introduce you to Jason Malcolm. Jason is managing principal of our ArcView Consulting Group, and Jason will go forward and introduce Jan and Josh and begin the program. Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you everybody for your time and attendance for today. Welcome to Valuation Litigation in the Cannabis Industry. I would like to introduce our first panelist, Josh Reeder, director at Stout. And then we have Jan Gidden, principal at Regulus Analytica. So welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Hope today is treating you well. So we have an interesting topic conversation. We have a lot to go through. So I kind of just want to dive in because as discussed, I would love to leave about 15, 20 minutes to answer some questions from the audience, which I think would be really beneficial to everyone that's on the line. So first question, I'm going to point to both of you. Josh, if you could answer first, and Jan, I'd like you to just opine on Josh's comments. But why would a business owner need a valuation in this industry?
Yeah, so there's really numerous reasons you could need a business valuation. And I think the best way to approach this is to kind of break it down into four buckets and provide some examples. So the first bucket would be transaction-driven valuations, and that could be, a purchase price allocation, a fairness opinion, a solvency opinion, a shareholder buyout pursuant to a buy-sell agreement. And then the second bucket is annual financial reporting or compliance-driven valuations. And some examples in that bucket would be a goodwill impairment test, valuation for 409A purposes, or an annual valuation for employee stock ownership plans or ESOPs. And the third bucket, which I'm going to call shareholder and succession planning, some examples there would be a personal goodwill valuation or a valuation for gift and estate tax reporting purposes. And then the final bucket, which we're going to dive into in greater detail here during this webinar, is valuations that are dispute driven. So that could be a shareholder oppression case, post-transaction dispute, shareholder dispute, divorce, or bankruptcy. So those are some of the examples of instances when you would need a business valuation.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that this is an exhaustive list that captures all the major buckets of why valuation would be required. I will just say that there is a difference between the fair market valuation and the fair value, which are not one and the same. And what we are focusing on for the purposes of this presentation is on the fair market valuation, not fair value.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. And what does that look like to our clients that are looking for a valuation themselves? Jan, you can start off.
Sure, I'll take a first step. So first of all, it's important to understand that there are two different types of valuation services, right? At least from my perspective and from a perspective of other practitioners. There is a conclusion of value, which requires independent application of the valuation methodologies and approaches that are deemed, in opinion of the practitioner, to be best fitting the purposes of the valuation. And then there is a calculation of value, which is less than, and it's based upon the agreed upon the approaches and the agreed upon methodologies that the client actively agrees to as part of the valuation. So once the type of service is selected, then normally what you would see is an engagement letter that captures the major understanding of the scope of services, the purpose of the valuation, the date of, the standard of value, the premise of value. And once these important details are captured, the next step in the sequence would be to perform and gather information about the company, which is either internal in nature, such as the history, the financial performance, customer, clientele base, the variety of products, and then also external in nature, such as general economic conditions for the region, general economic conditions for the industry. An important component of the overall process is the financial analysis, which itself is predicated on normalization of the financial statements, trend lines, running of the ratios, comparison of the ratios to the industry comparables, and then subsequently an application of the selected valuation approaches, which we will talk about in detail later on, and then the issuance of the report. So that's kind of a broadly defined major elements of the evaluation process.
Yeah, and if I can just add, one thing to the process overall, I would say it's a very collaborative process with the company that we're working with. I've done hundreds of valuations in my career, and I can tell you each one is a little bit different. And so we're going to have constant communication with, management and stakeholders at the company throughout that whole process that Jan just went through.
When when you're speaking to a client, and again, this is directed at both of you, is there something you look for in terms of a period of time they've been in business for? So if they're 6 months old, is that something that you could justify a valuation for? Or do they have to be at least over a year or show some level of maturity in order to provide that level of service?
I can take it for a
Well,
second.
yeah, go ahead, Josh.
No, so the operating history of the company really factors into, I would say, the risk of the company. So you can value a company pre-revenue. You need to have really detailed discussions with management and a business plan in place. And then it's up to the business valuation practitioner to really risk assess that plan when determining the value. So I would say the longer the company operates, typically that could mean there's less risk involved, but it doesn't mean that you can't do a valuation if a company only has a few months of operations.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, obviously, when valuing early stage companies, the valuation is complicated by the lack of recorded performance and available sales figures. And then in order to apply certain approaches, specifically income approach, such as the discounted cash flows, we would like to rely on the existing history to assess past performance. That certainly makes it easier. From my perspective, I do prefer when the company can furnish financial records and demonstrate established operations for at least a number of years versus the early stage company.
Great. And this is actually a great segue into our next question, which is really about what are some of the common approaches? So you kind of broke it down of what you look for, the structure, but what are some of the, like, for example, Josh, income approach? What are some of the pros and cons, and what does an income approach look like?
Yeah, so at a high level, the income approach is one of the most common methods used to value a company. And it's based on projecting out future free cash flow for a company and discounting it to present value as of a specific date. Mm-hmm. And within the income approach, there's really two methods you can look at. There is the capitalized cash flow method. So this is for companies where earnings are relatively stable and predictable, and you can use a single period capitalization model. And then there's the discounted cash flow method. And this is used when companies are expecting varying rates of growth going forward. So you would develop a 3, 5, 7, 10-year forecast, and then discount those annual cash flows back to the valuation date. And the discount rate that you use for either of those methods is going to capture the risk of the investment and the time value of money. And it'll consider, things such as the interest rate environment as of that specific date, as well as subject company factors. And a couple of examples could be industry risk and size risk. So at a high level, that's what the income approach is to valuation.
Would you typically combine that with something like a asset approach?
Typically not. So it'll depend on the company. So there may be a circumstance when you do it, but if you're valuing an operating company, so a company that makes a product or sells a service, typically you would look at the income approach and not an asset approach. An asset approach is used primarily for holding companies. So companies that don't make a product, don't sell a service, but maybe they hold a piece of real estate or an investment portfolio. That's really when the asset approach comes into play.
I see. Makes sense. And the third is market approach, which I think most people are aware of in this call. I mean, we always get asked all the time, and at ArcView is, what is the market value of such licenses and operations within their respective states? So Jan, can you just give us an overview of what that looks like for the client and some of the pros and cons that go along with a market approach?
Sure. I think market approach is probably more complex, even though it looks deceptively simple. Because unlike the income approach, which is intrinsic in nature, it's based on the fundamentals of a particular company. Market approach is relative in nature because it's relative to the other similar transactions or transactions of similar companies in the industry. Now, the objective here would be to estimate value based on how similar these comparable companies are priced by the market. And really, there are three sources of information relied on for the market approach. First, it's the public company records, transactions that are reported in the open market. Then there are private company transactions. These are primarily reported by the brokers. And then there are also prior transactions in the subject company itself. There are a number of databases that provide all the pricing details. But the broad approaches of the market approach is to identify a comparable company, compare that value of those comparables or the multiples to the company being analyzed, and then convert these market comps into a standardized value. Now, in my opinion, the use of the market approach has significant advantages and also significant disadvantages. So I'll briefly go through them. The advantages of the market approach, Jason, as you had said, that it's intuitive and it's widely known, and it's logical to assume that a company's value will more or less approximate or will trend the values of the companies, of similar companies, with the similar products, similar geographies, similar business performance. The approach itself relies on the actual transactional data, so it's not based on, like the income approach, it's not based on the estimates or the workouts of a discount rate, which can include some certain assumptions that are might be subjective in nature. And lastly, the market approach relies or requires less information than, let's say, discounted cash flow, for example, just because the multiples are available. Now, the significant disadvantages of the market approach is that the method relies on the actually completed transactions, but the data might be stale, right? So if you are looking to value a company today and you are relying on the data from 3 years ago, for example, well, we all know what was happening 3 years ago. So the values themselves are not aligned on the timeline, and it might not be reflective of the current market condition, but might in fact reflect the conditions that existed at the time, which means that if the market conditions were depressed, well, then the values are depressed, and then you're trying to derive the values for your current transactions from the depressed timeline. And conversely, if the historical transactions took place during the period of market exuberance, then the valuations itself would be somewhat might not be realistic, or might reflect that market exuberance and might not necessarily be relevant to the current transaction. And lastly, and probably most importantly, it's very difficult to find a Goldilocks company, right? A company that exactly matches the subject company's footprint, that exactly matches the subject company performance. And therefore, inevitably, then you might be forced to start adjusting the multiples, which introduces its own set of complications. I will say that market approach is widely used. It's widely used by many practitioners, but it is not the approach that will give you the ideal comparable or the ideal measure of value.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question that's actually fits perfectly in this segment. I typically don't ask questions until the very end, but it's a great question because it's something that, again, we get approached quite a bit about. I'm sure you have as well. Well, what about pre-revenue companies? And then Josh, I'll have you take this one first, and Yanni could opine.
Yeah, so I mean, for pre-revenue companies, having that business plan that I talked about previously is really important for both if you're going to apply a discounted cash flow method or a market approach. Because under the market approach, there is a precedent transaction method. So that's based on transactions that took place in the past. And there's also a guideline public company method. And that's looking at publicly traded companies that you deem comparable to the company you're valuing. And in this space specifically, there's publicly traded MSOs that have forecasts. So you could look at for a pre-revenue company, you could look at forecasted multiples for these publicly traded MSOs and try to draw comparisons to the company that you're valuing and potentially apply a multiple. I will say for pre-revenue companies, that's probably going to be difficult to do. And it really comes down to an income approach based on a management forecast. And then it would have a higher risk factor just because there's no operating history. So your discount rate that you would use to discount that business plan would be higher relative to a company that does have operations.
Yeah, I will say that valuation of a pre-revenue company can be split into two broad directions, right? So firstly, as just described, it's reliance on the market method and looking at the similar companies and all the difficulties that it might imply. But also, it might be a pre-revenue company with a unique IP, for example, right? Means and ways of gathering pollen, for example, or something that makes it less labor intensive. And then really what you would valuing, in fact, is this IP component of a company itself. And that is predicated on the market analysis, that is predicated on a slew of other inputs that are that are tangentially related to valuation. So it really does depend. If it's a pre-revenue company and it doesn't have a unique IP, then inevitably you are forced to look at the market comparables. And if it has a unique IP, then you are valuing that specific IP component.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. Okay, moving on to valuation of cannabis, right? So what are the most important factors to consider when valuing a cannabis business? And how, if at all, do they differ from valuing a company that is not in the industry? Great example would be the 280E issues. Jan, I'll have you jump on this one if you don't mind.
Sure. So as we all know, businesses have costs, and those costs are part of the financial reporting. Indirect costs, direct costs, where cannabis is concerned, those costs might be flower touching, and they might not be related to handling the product. Those costs still would be reflected on the financial reporting, right? However, when it comes to taxation, the Internal Revenue Code 280E prohibits deduction of any expenses that had been incurred in carrying out any trade or business if such trade or business consisted of trafficking or dealing with controlled substances, meaning Schedule 1 or Schedule 2, which are prohibited by the federal law or by the state law. So what that necessarily means is that a cannabis producer may include those customary expenses into the cost of goods sold and might subtract them for the purpose of the financial reporting. But when it comes to taxation and also revenue restoration for business interruption, insurance coverage, those costs which are flower touching and which are prohibited by the Internal Revenue Code 280E might not be included into the taxable tax return. So what that necessarily means is that the enterprise will be taxed not on the taxable income, but instead will be taxed on the gross income, which will, for all intents and purposes, mean that the much higher tax rate. So that is a significant difference where the cannabis enterprise is concerned from every other enterprise. And similarly, when it comes time to file a claim under the business interruption insurance, as I had mentioned, and when the business has to show its restored revenue during the period of restoration, some expenses which for a regular business would have been included into the workout and then subsequently would have been subject to insurance coverage for cannabis does not hold true, unfortunately.
Said a couple of key words there, revenue restoration and insurance, which is a topic that we'll be discussing in greater detail, hopefully sometime next month. But thank you, Jan, for that. And Josh, on your side, so cannabis, as everyone knows, is regulated on a state basis. So you have medicinal states, recreational states, and states that don't partake whatsoever. Um, so the supply and demand directly impacts pricing and is different at every state level. So what are some of the risk factors that are specific to that industry that's on this topic?
Yeah, so there's several things that you'll need to consider when valuing companies, because like you said, each state is essentially its own market. So if we think about from a market approach perspective, it may be difficult to apply that approach in certain circumstances. First, there's just sometimes not a lot of good verifiable data out there. And in addition, if you do have a transaction with some really good data, but it's in a limited license state, it may not be reasonable or appropriate to apply that multiple to an operator in an unlimited license state, as an example. So you want to make sure that you work through those dynamics. And then as it relates to the guideline public company method that we touched on earlier, the MSOs have operations across numerous states. So if one state is down, another might be up, and that lowers their risk relative to a single state operator. So that's something that you'll have to work through as well if you're valuing a company that only has operations in one state and is dependent on that state. In addition, I mentioned valuation date a few times. So, business valuation, we can value a company as of any date. It could be a current valuation or, in a litigation setting, it's often a date in the past. So it's really important in this industry in particular to understand the state of the industry as of a specific date. What were the supply and demand dynamics at that point in time, and appropriately apply that to your valuation. And then, as it relates specifically to supply and demand, how this works is typically once a state legalizes marijuana, there's a period of high prices, right? But when you're developing projections or reviewing projections, you can't assume that pricing dynamic is going to continue indefinitely. Because as we have seen, as supply catches up to demand in any given market, prices are going to come down. And that impacts cash flow, impacts the income approach, and the market approach. And the time period over which that occurs in each state is actually decreasing because you're getting operators going now from state to state that have experience scaling operations. So the time period over which you get premium pricing in newer states is shortening relative to previous years. So that's something else you'll need to consider. And then just from an overall risk perspective, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the industry has been relatively volatile historically. In addition, there is sometimes a lack of access to capital. And, many businesses have a limited operating history. So those factors will increase a discount rate or a required rate of return for companies that operate in this industry.
Yeah, and I mean, we're at the point right now that changes are right around the corner in the industry, and cannabis has been down over the last couple of years. It's been, like a normal market. It's volatile, but in this case, we've been on the downside more often in the last couple of years. And I could probably speak for everyone on this call. We're really looking forward to the rescheduling process and what's that going to bring to the table. What does 280E look like going forward after the rescheduling? What does cross-border commerce look like? Are you going to be able to distribute, cannabis from California to the East Coast? I doubt it. It'll be interesting to see what pharmacies now do with medical marijuana going forward, since it's going to be a Schedule III drug. How insurance companies come into play, but all those regulation changes will hopefully have a positive change to the industry, where capital is now coming back in. Investors, not just cannabis investors, but outside investors like Wall Street investors, now look at it as a safer place to place their money and place some bets on operators and brands. So we'll see what happens with that, and I hope that actually works out to our benefit. I want to kind of switch over to litigation issues in the interest of time, if you guys don't mind, because again, I would like to leave some time for some questions. So Jan, explain to me when does litigation support need arise, and what have you seen so far in the market?
Right. Well, let's firstly map or define what gives rise to litigation in the context of the cannabis industry. So really, it's not that different from any other industry. First of all, the breach of contract, right? It's a situation, a commercial dispute, where it's alleged that one of the parties had failed to fulfill its obligations under the contract, and as a result had breached the contract, which subsequently gives rise to plaintiffs' claims for compensatory damages based on the lost profits, as well as the direct damages, which flow directly from the act of the breach itself. Also, litigation arises as a result of intellectual property, which I believe are covered, intellectual property disputes, which are part of a tort, trademark naming disputes, use of intellectual property seed that's been genetically modified, et cetera, as well as revenue restoration in cases where there is dispute between the insurance company and the claimant, matrimonial, which we touched upon earlier. There is valuation in the context of matrimonial, but if it's a contested divorce situation, well, then the parties inevitably head to court. And also forensic accounting issues that could be internal, or external in nature. Now, broadly speaking, there are additional elements that give rise to litigation. Partnership oppression lawsuits, where minority partners allege oppression by the majority partners for a variety of reasons. And as I had mentioned, revenue restoration claims. Those are very specific and might be standalone in the broader scheme of things, but there is no dispute as to the damage that occurred. It's a dispute of how much of the damage would be covered by the insurance. So those are the typical sources or typical reasons for why litigation occurs.
Great, thank you for that. And what are some of the most common approaches for economic damages calculation?
Right. So let's define the damages first of all. There is a expectation damage, also called benefit of the bargain. That's basically the difference between what injured party expected to have received and what it had actually received. And then there is a reliance damage. That's basically an amount that's required to restore the injured party to the economic position before the event that injured the party had taken place. In any economic damage situation, the following has to be demonstrated. First of all, causation. And causation is demonstrated by the following variables. Loss has actually occurred immediately as an outcome of the alleged wrong event, and evidence that's sufficient enough to prove that the event itself had given rise and had resulted in loss. There has to be a reasonable certainty that the calculation of damages is anchored in facts and is predicated on the sound methodologies. And then there also has to be an element of foreseeability that in the contractual relationship, the damages could have been reasonably foreseen if one of the parties reneged and didn't perform up to the contractual specifications. Now, typically, the first step in estimating damages or estimation of lost profits is to show lost revenues, which were lost as a result of the event subject to the litigation. Now, there are a number of steps in determining lost revenues. and that really is often one of the most challenging aspects. But broadly speaking, the common relied on methodologies is the before and after method, which compares the but-for revenues estimated using the performance before the event or before the alleged action and the actual revenues. There is a yardstick or the benchmark method, which relies, just like a market evaluation approach, it relies on comparable companies' performance and comparable companies' revenues. There are specific approaches that are predicated on the nature of a contractual relationship, and the contracts might actually specify how lost revenues are estimated. And lastly, lost profits are calculated as lost revenues less incremental costs and expenses, also called the avoidable expenses. And these are the expenses that were avoided or not incurred as a result of the revenues that were not earned. The methodologies and the approaches for economic damages and lost profits, lost revenue estimates could very well be a webinar in and of itself, and we're just skimming the surface here. But those, broadly speaking, are the industry accepted methodologies and approaches.
Great, thank you. It sounds like a yardstick is similar to like a market valuation approach. Is that accurate?
Well, again, it is in the sense that you are looking at the performance of companies in the related field.
Got it. Thank you, Jan. And Josh, what role does a third-party evaluation play in resolving disputes? What has been your experience on that side?
Yeah, so I mean, when you engage a third party to do evaluation, you're getting an independent assessment on the value of the business. So business valuation professionals, we have the qualifications, credentials, and experience of conducting numerous valuations to support our work. And, you know, our work product is almost always scrutinized by a third party, whether that's an auditor, the DOL, the SEC, a trier of fact, or an opposing expert. So we understand how to support and defend our work because our work product is almost always reviewed by a third party.
Got it. Thank you. Do you have any access to specific data sets that you use for some of your valuations, or is it based on experience and knowledge in the market that you have?
I think it's a combination. You know, there's certainly market research. You know, some examples could be Bloomberg or S&P Capital IQ. Specific to the cannabis industry, there is some pretty good third-party data out there, whether that's the MJ Biz Factbook or Cannabis Benchmarks, New Frontier data for wholesale pricing. And then you can also look at, you know, publicly traded filings of companies in the cannabis industry as well. And then, you know, firms typically have their own proprietary valuation models and templates that we use and are developed over the years. So those are some of the things that we can bring to the table.
Great, thank you.
I will add that obviously scale does matter, and obviously you know, Capital IQ or Bloomberg are the gold standards in databases and financial information history. That's like driving a Ferrari for all intents and purposes. I don't know, Josh, if you drive the Ferrari. Very often, where cannabis is concerned, you know, you're not at a scale that, or at least in my experience, you're not at a scale where you might need to use Capital IQ. I mean, I use BizComp's database, you know, BizMiners, RMA Associates that provide the good history of ratios. Obviously, Kroll when dealing with the cost of capital workout, but you have to adjust the use of the databases to the type of a company. Obviously, if it's a $100 million MSO, well, probably you have to go with the Capital IQ. If it's a mom and pop retailer, then that's going to be an overkill, and probably such company will not be captured by Capital IQ. So,
great, thank you. And Jan, I want to start with you here for the last question that we have. how can cannabis businesses prepare for litigations or potential litigations, and also protect their valuation?
Well, I would say that any business owner should know who his or her friends are, right? So obviously, it starts with having a good CPA, and I'm not saying it just because I'm a CPA. It really is important to have a good record keeping, to have good sale records, especially in the cannabis. And that comes in handy in many cases. You should have your insurance agent. You should have your attorney, and at least have someone that you work with, even though it might be periodically, so that when the time comes, you're not stretching out and trying to find the right people. And also, it's knowing the rules and regulations of a specific place where you operate.
Yeah, what I would add to that, and just from a business valuation perspective, is having good corporate governance documents that could clearly define, what could happen if a dispute arises. And typically that could be outlined in a shareholder agreement or an operating agreement for the company. And what I see often is it's not very well defined in those agreements what or how the value should be determined. Things like, is it fair market value or fair value? What is the appraisal process? So companies can work with legal counsel and potentially business valuation professionals to refine that language and have it set up front. So if there is a dispute in the future, there are some clearly defined parameters.
Great. Thank you both for your time. John, did you want to say something? Apologies.
No. I think just Josh gave a great overview of the type of contractual stipulations that are a must to have.
Thank you. Okay, so for everyone on the call, that does it. And for our questions, we would love to hear from you. We did have that pre-revenue cannabis company question before, which Josh and Jan both answered. Looking forward to additional questions. If you have any, please put it in the chat.
While we're waiting for the, are there any questions?
Not just, oh, yeah, hold on. Okay, how many, here they come. How many litigation support engagements do you each have per year on average? That was one question.
Yeah, I guess I can start. So it really depends. I look at more from how much of my time is spent on it, because sometimes litigation projects can have a really long tail and go over many months. So it's probably close to half of my time is on litigation related engagements, and the other half is valuation for, real world transactions, fairness opinions, solvency opinions, shareholder buyouts, things of that nature.
Yeah. I operate in the ecosystem of smaller companies, and the litigation is a one-off event, or one-off occurrence in lifetime of each of those companies, right? I mean, you don't get you don't engage in commercial disputes every year, right? Also, very often, given the cost of litigation, very often these things tend not to go to trial, and there is an out-of-court settlement. So I would say it does not come up as often as I would have liked it to be the case.
Okay, thank you, and apologies for I keep on muting my microphone, but there's some background noise, so I don't want to disturb your responses. Is there a specific multiplier used for cannabis companies? Jan, if you want to take that one.
I don't necessarily use a specific multiplier. I don't engage. It's never a good idea to engage in valuation with a predetermined idea of what that multiplier would be. Now, there are rules of thumb, as it were, but those are not an approved methodology. So the answer is no.
Josh, yeah.
Same here. The short answer is no, there's no specific multiplier. And just, as you and I have talked about today, the industry's been really volatile, specifically the cannabis industry. So again, multiples have moved quite a bit over the years, and that's why there just isn't a specific multiple you could apply. And every business is different too, different profitability, growth outlook, size, risk, and all that needs to be considered.
I have a question, and I'll get to a couple more that's coming in. Are you able to conduct a valuation on a company that has negative cash flow or they're not profitable? Is that something that is feasible in the cannabis industry?
Yes.
Are they? Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jan. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, are they in liquidation? If it's a negative, are they in bankruptcy? Are they in some kind of a fire sale situation? If that's the case, then we briefly touched upon it. You could value a company that's going through liquidation, using your asset approach, for example, if they have assets.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where the collaboration comes into, because valuations is predicated on future earnings. So maybe there's a really good story for why earnings historically haven't been positive. And there's something that's going to come right around the corner where the company is going to become profitable. That's where we'd want to have discussions with management and the company to understand that. But if that's not the case, then to Jan's point, we have to look at maybe a liquidation premise.
Understood. Thank you. Going back to that litigation question of how many litigations have you seen per year? There's a follow-up question to that by the same person. So what do you see the most of? Is it shareholder disputes? Is it fraud and damages? What has been your experience so far? Jan, if you want to take that. Sorry, apologies.
Sure. I would say that what I see mostly is the revenue restoration claims for business interruption insurance. Now, commercial litigation where trademarks are concerned, trademark disputes are concerned, probably would be second, but in my experience, it's mostly revenue restoration claims.
And Josh, what about on your side?
Yeah, I mean, it's really all over the board. I would say for me, just given my background experience, I've worked on projects that are shareholder disputes or post-transaction disputes primarily.
Got it. What proportion of cannabis litigation settle versus go to trial? Is there like an 80-20 type of calculation that's used, or Jan, you're laughing, so maybe you want to take that one?
Look, I don't have the, from my perspective, it's very hard to say, what's the proportion that goes to trial. Again, commercial litigation is a one-off event in the lifetime of any company, and primarily more so a company that's involved in cannabis. So.
Yeah, I don't have a specific percentage to that. I mean, each case is different.
Okay, great. And we do have one more question as of now. But again, feel free, we have another 10 minutes for Q&A. What factors do you take into account for discount, for lack of control, and discount for lack of marketability?
I can take a first stab at that. So typically you see those discounts when the standard of value is fair market value and you're valuing a minority interest, so a less than 50% interest in a company. And so a discount for lack of control is used to capture, if you're a minority shareholder in a private company, I can't control the day-to-day operations. I can't control what management's paid or what the capital structure is. So that would warrant a discount. And that's what a discount for lack of control largely captures. And then a discount for lack of marketability again, you're a minority shareholder in a private company. I can't go on Fidelity and sell my shares tomorrow morning, right? It's going to be a long process. So there's a time to liquidity. In addition, I don't have control over, when or if I'm going to get any sort of distributions from cash flows, which is a marketability factor. So those are a couple of items to consider when you're looking at discounts for lack of control and lack of marketability.
Yeah, I will add that we talk about the discounts, but broadly speaking, valuation formula for the income approach is very simple, right? It's your benefit stream divided by your discount rate. But there are peculiarities to defining your benefit stream. We talked a lot about the discount rate. You could have your net cash flow to equity or net cash flow to invested capital, and both could be used for control, and each could be used. And rather, one is used for the situation of control, and the other is used for the situation of lack of control, right? You could, for either of these benefit streams, you could rely on your discount to DCF method or the capitalization method, but defining what exactly you are valuing is the first, second, and third step, because that really does define your subsequent approaches, derivation of your benefit streams, definition of your discount rates. And even then, it's all would be based on the type of a company. If it's a company with a complex capital structure, right, you might use your weighted average cost of capital. If it's somewhat of a simpler company, you might use your build-up method to derive your discount rates. So all these complications are really derived from the start based on what exactly you are valuing. And one last item I'll add to the question of control and lack of control. If you're valuing a company and it's on a control basis, well, then normalization of the financials is one thing. If you're valuing a company on lack of control basis, well, then can't necessarily normalize the financials because the ownership interest doesn't have the control or the managerial responsibility to direct certain outflows of operational cash for expenses. So all these factors have to be considered.
Great, thank you. And guys, I think that is all. I'm not seeing any more questions come through, but that was very informative. And I want to once again thank both of you for your time today and contributing to this webinar. I appreciate it. Jeff, I'm going to turn it to you for closing remarks.
So guys, just before anybody leaves, first let's quickly thank Josh and Jan and Jason for sharing their knowledge. But I also want to read a quick disclaimer that I should have done at the beginning, just so everyone's clear. This webinar was for informational purposes only. Now I'm going to read the legalese. Nothing discussed here should be taken as tax or legal advice. And for the purposes of taxation or litigation, please contact your CPA, your tax advisor, or your attorney. All right. Now that that's out of the way, I really enjoyed this. I thought there were some great learnings. I jotted a few down just in summary, right? The unique risk factors that's unique to the cannabis industry because it's a state-by-state industry. For example, some state programs are vertically integrated. Some are limited licenses. That affects the multiple that could be applied on earnings. Premium pricing is usually what you see at launch, and then it levels off. So the stage of the state program is important when you're figuring out what a multiple will be. And even though it wasn't mentioned today, the impact of the loophole in the Farm Bill, which may or may not get closed up, that enables the sale of hemp-derived cannabinoids to be sold direct to consumers over state lines and getting around all the regulation, that's a factor. Will that go away? How do you handicap that? All of these affect the method evaluation and the outcome. So it was great stuff. I learned a lot. I hope you guys did. Again, I can't thank Josh, Jan, and Jason enough. Again, if you have any additional questions, I think we put Jason's email in the chat group. Please grab that. We'll field them. We'll get back to you with the answers. And please be on the lookout for our replay. We're going to post it in a couple of days at www.arcviewgroup.com. This was great. Thank you all very much. And again, to all of our viewers, thank you for spending your time with us and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Got it. Thank you, guys.